Hello everyone, my name's Diane. Thanks for having me here to speak this evening. I'm a chartered town planner and as Pete said, I work as the Principal Planning Officer in the policy team at Lancaster City Council. I do have some kind of sheets here, but they're the world's smallest for this room, so apologies if you can't see them there. I'm going to try and run through plan making, how we then determine planning applications, and then just a little bit more about housing in general and then how that fits into the climate change agenda. So quite a lot to fit in really. In terms of plan making, as I said, I work in the planning policy section, so principal one of our jobs is to write the local plan, which is this document here that some of you may or may not have seen. This contains all the policies that planning applications are determined against. Now, as you probably can't see from here, it has to be in conformity to central government's policies, so what we call a national planning policy framework and national planning policy guidance. And in it, there's a raft of policies. They cover lots of different areas, and it's all got to be based on evidence, and it all has to be consulted on. So it covers things like housing, environment, retail, employment, infrastructure, and heritage and conservation issues as well. And then that all feeds in together and we write actual policies. And as I said, that creates the development plan for Lancaster district. Now you can also have what we call neighbourhood plans as well, and that feeds into them. So they're at a more local level, so you'll get parish councils coming together, creating steering groups to write their own policies for their areas, but it does all have to comply with this document. We do an independent check of it. We've got to think about the social, the environmental and the economic impact of all of the policies that we write in the document, and it is monitored as well by something called an authority monitoring report, just to check that the policies that are being implemented are actually working. So that's a very, very, very quick kind of summary of how we write a plan, how we write this document. And as I said, this is then used to determine planning applications. So say somebody decides to build something, say I want to build a house. The process that they would follow is they would submit an application to the planning department. That would then get validated by the validation team. So that means getting all the information together that's needed to make a decision. It would be assigned to a case officer, site visits would be done, site notices would go up to let people know that an application's come in. Things like neighbour notifications will be sent out, so for anyone that it directly affects will be made aware of a development. And then we would do consultation exercises as well with, say, the Highways Authority, education providers, utility providers, all those kind of people. And the case officer would then bring all that information together and make a recommendation. Now they can only recommend, they don't actually make a decision. The decision is made by the councillors or the members at a planning committee. Now they can choose to go with that recommendation of an approval or a refusal, or they can choose to go against that. Now obviously if they go against that, that can then be appealed, and there is often financial implications of that. So I'll go on to that a bit later on. If an application is approved, decision notice is issued, and then off you go. You can go and build your house, and you just have to make sure you comply with building regulations. So that's kind of how we would then determine a planning application. Just looking at housing in a bit more kind of general, and some of the things that we think about when we're writing the local plan, we've got to think about need, type, location, the size of properties, density, and some other considerations as well. But if you just take need as a starting point, we do something called an objectively assessed need assessment. Now that looks at how much housing should we be building in the district, or how much should we be permitting in the district. Now at the moment that's 371 houses a year. That's what it averages out at. Now over the last 10 to 12 years, that's been under-delivered by just over 650 houses. So it can affect the determination of applications, because if you don't have enough supply, then it does give developers the opportunity to kind of put an argument forward to say, well, you really should be approving this. There's not enough going on, there's not enough being built. So that can come into the mix there. And also, after we've determined applications, not everything in terms of housing will actually get built. Some permissions lapse, some just don't progress for one reason or another. So we've always got to have a good supply of housing applications that have been permitted. We have to look at the location. Is it in the right place? We, as planning officers, do allocate sites for development. through allocations in the local plan. But that said, applications can come forward on any parcel of land at any point in time, irrespective of whether someone even owns the land. And we as a local planning authority do have a duty to actually look at that. So a lot of the time people say, why are you looking at this piece of land? Why are you looking at this housing scheme? We just have to do that. It's our duty to do it. Density and size, our national average is 30 dwellings per hectare in terms of the level of housing that can be built. We would always, as part of determining application, look at the kind of local area, trying to make it a bit more in keeping, but that's generally where it kind of lies. And other considerations, if you've got a big housing scheme, you would look at open space, infrastructure provision, things like flooding, is that being taken into account, utilities, roads, education provision, all those kind of things all have to be considered when you're looking at housing schemes. Just to give you a bit of an idea, we've currently got just under 63,000 homes in the district. Now, if we're looking moving forward in terms of climate change agenda, if we were to build the amount of housing that's been identified as needed, when I talked about that objectively assessed need, that's nearly 400 houses a year. If we were to look at that over the next 10 years, you're only going to add to the housing stock by 6%. So that's going to leave 94% of the houses in the district as existing stock. So we really need to start thinking about retrofitting existing properties. It's okay building new houses and thinking about the kind of the new technologies that you might be able to put into those, but as I said, 94%, it's quite a significant number really, so it's something that we do really need to be thinking about.
Will you be explaining what retrofitting is?
Retrofitting is going back to existing properties and seeing if there's anything that we can change about that property or add to that property to make it more kind of climate friendly, energy efficient, that kind of thing. That makes sense? Yeah, as I said, we do have a duty to determine all applications. You know, we can't pick and choose which we do and we don't. And if we do resist applications and it goes against the policies in this plan, you know, if we say, no, we're not going to approve it, as I said, it can go to an appeal. And with appeals can come costs being awarded against the council if it's been seen as a kind of an unfair reason for refusing an application, and it's public money at the end of the day, so we do always have to be thinking about that. So I was asked to kind of think about what I would like to see as a professional planner in terms of tackling the climate change agenda. You know, what would be great things could we do if possible? Because we can often feel quite unempowered, to be honest, as planners. Central government don't make it easy for us at a local level to make things change. We definitely like to create places, not just more housing estates, you know, not just more anywhere housing. You know, the houses that you get in Milton Keynes, London, it's the same. It's, you know, often bog standard schemes, and we'd really like to be a bit more unique for the area. Have more renewable energy requirements on site. Better flood resilience specific to the location, more on-site what we call green infrastructure, so more open space, tree planting, that kind of thing. Schemes aren't just developed around the car, you know, like more bikes sharing schemes, car sharing schemes, that kind of thing. Yeah, and then more energy efficiency requirements. It's very difficult at the moment at a local level to set those ourselves. And that's really difficult to achieve for two main reasons, something called a 5-year supply and viability. So they're two issues where it's easy for developers to come along and say, we can't provide this over and above what you're asking for because we can't afford it. You know, and it'd be really great if central government would help us out with that. And we're also a two-tier authority, so we're not responsible for highways, and then we're not the lead flood authority. So ultimately that's Lancashire County Council that deal with that. Now we do work closely with them, but we don't have the overall responsibility for those things. So just to kind of sum up, you probably gathered it's not a simple process planning, and this is a very, very quick run through of it. It's very time consuming to make plans, and we can't really be reactive quick enough. We would like more flexibility from government to set standards at a local level and be more flexible, and just allow us to be a bit more proactive in designing schemes and new housing rather than being reactive to the applications that come into us. Right.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you by video link. So my name's Purin Desai. I co-founded an organisation called Bioregional about 25 years ago, and just to give you some of my background, I've been involved in sustainable housing for about 20 years. So 20 years ago, I put together a project called the BedZ development in South London. It's that's Beddington Zero Fossil Energy Development. So it's one of the first schemes to look at really running, building really efficient. Okay, yeah. So I put that project. It's 100 homes. It was a mix of social housing and private housing, and then after that created a framework called One Planet Living, which we've used in. I've led teams in 20 countries, writing sustainability strategies for over 20,000 homes in 20 countries. And I was also responsible for introducing or chairing the group which recommended the introduction of the A to G energy labelling of homes. So now, whenever you buy a home, it has to be energy labelled. And so I'm very pleased to be here with you to share a few of my experiences. And there are three main messages I want to get across. First of all, I think when you're looking at homes, really think about lifestyles. So think about how a home supports a healthy, sustainable lifestyle. So don't think about homes in isolation. Don't think about them as just inanimate objects. Think about them as how they can support a healthy, happy lifestyle. Second message I want to get across is that it's really important that everyone understands what sustainability might mean. So we really need to change our culture to one where everyone understands, has a good understanding, a basic understanding of sustainability, and that if we try and drive too much through regulations and standards, it just makes life impossible for everyone. So culture change is more important, in my view, than regulation and standards, although there is a place for regulations and standards. And the third point I get across is, keep it simple. So when explaining sustainability, of course, explain it simply. When we're looking at regulations or recommendations or policies, it's really best to keep them as simple as possible. And having worked with lots of engineers over the years, they can make things much more complicated than they need to be. So use the simplicity test when looking at what policies you might recommend or put in place. So those are the key messages. And then thinking, about homes, as I said, and as the previous speaker rightly said, there's we can differentiate between existing homes and new homes, and there'll be many more of the homes around in 20 years' time which have been built today than new homes being built. So it's worth understanding that. But even new homes, I would say, think about how they can support a sustainable lifestyle. Of course, we need to think about the energy that they're consuming from heating and lighting the homes, but also the appliances in the homes. And we can look at retrofitting those homes, so putting in things like roof insulation, things like better glazing, of course, cavity wall insulation. But there soon comes a point when it's actually very expensive to retrofit a home for the amount of saving, both in financial terms and in terms of emissions of carbon dioxide. So so I would say on that, in the retrofitting side, really focus on what's simple and don't push boundaries too far, otherwise it ends up very expensive. We can also, of course, put in things like renewable energy onto existing buildings. Again, I would say do it where it's easy, where it's cost effective. But really the big savings in the past 10, 15 years and the big savings in the next 10 to 15 years are going to be from large scale renewables. And that's particularly things like large wind farms. Look at decentralized energy, as we say, so opportunities to generate energy on buildings, but don't push it too far. Some engineers I found push it way too far, and it ends up very expensive to do. But coming back to this sort of idea of a home as a place which supports a particular lifestyle, think about the home not just from the energy perspective of that home, but think about how dependent that makes you on a car. Are there ways in which you can, for example, introduce things like car sharing schemes? Be very successful, can save a lot of money, massive potential health benefits in that. And we generally now are leading lifestyles which are not only consume a lot of or release a lot of carbon dioxide, but they're not very healthy. So, for example, 40% of NHS spending is now on diseases which are primarily caused by diet, lifestyle, and things like environmental pollution, so pollution from cars. So thinking about the home in the context of the wider neighbourhood is very important. Can we get car sharing schemes, for example, in local neighbourhoods? Get people maybe onto things like even electric bikes now. They're becoming very popular and they're very efficient. And my simple lesson, this is not one which many people like to hear, but my simple lesson over the last 20 years is the single most effective intervention you can take to make communities more carbon efficient and healthier is to remove as many cars as possible. Okay. So that's got so many benefits on all sorts of levels. So keep that in mind. I'm not saying everywhere needs to be to become car free, but keep that in mind and how that relates to homes. I would say there may be some, I know councils are just starting to experiment with the idea, for example, of varying business rates and perhaps even council tax on the basis of how energy efficient a home is, and matching that with grants to help people improve the energy efficiency of homes. So there might be some opportunities in that. Looking at new build homes, again, think lifestyles. There is, in some ways, a bigger opportunity with new build homes to start thinking about supporting a whole sustainable, healthy lifestyle. So looking at the density at which homes are built, so putting them closer together so everything is within walking and cycling distance, reducing the number of cars, putting more green space, looking at less paved areas for flood prevention, which was mentioned again earlier. Again, I would recommend not pushing too hard for on-site renewables, so doing the, encouraging them, but really looking at more is the opportunity for things like community-owned energy services companies. So I established one for a development, so I've been a real estate developer as well. I did one for a scheme where I'm speaking from in Brighton, and I ran that for 10 years. But we were able to provide guaranteed green electricity, bulk buy. We ran some on-site renewables, but we also bulk bought guaranteed green electricity for our residents. So we were able to supply 100% renewable energy at 20% cost saving to our residents. So I think things like energy cooperatives, community-owned energy services companies are possibly a great way to go. I think that's where I'll have to stop. So think lifestyles, really promote this culture change. We all need to start living a whole sustainable lifestyle, and our homes must support that lifestyle, and keep it simple. Don't push things too far in certain areas, and look at things holistically, and bring for example, the house building industry along with you in that process. Thank you very much.
Hi, Nick Rogers. I'm the Group Design Director of Taylor Wimpey, a large house builder. We build 10,000 homes a year, out of probably 200 to 250,000 new homes across the country. So we're a significant proportion of that. Dan mentioned how many existing homes there were in Lancaster. Well, in the UK, there are 26 million. So if we're only building 200 to 250,000 new homes a year, it's going to take a long time to replace those. So as she said, there's a big thing in the existing housing stock. But what are we doing as a house builder? We affect sustainability and climate change and energy use in three ways. The first is, like any big company, in the way we work, and we're doing all the things like trying to do many Skype calls and make our own buildings more efficient, make our sites more efficient, and all of that sort of stuff. And you can read about that in our sustainability report if you want to. The second, and this is what Diane was talking about a lot, is the communities, the places that we build. And I'm very keen that we move away in the planning and building industry from saying we've designed a layout or we've designed an estate. No, we want to build places where people come and live, and all the things that Dan said about green infrastructure, that's the grass, the trees, but also making that green spaces multi-purpose. So we're not just planting grass for a football pitch, but you've got to think about, well, what's the wildlife there? How's it working to take drainage away from where we're building? Is it doing many things rather than just being a single-use piece of green grass that has no biological impact? The main thing about the places we build, though, is where they are. That's the single biggest thing that affects their sustainability. And the problem that both of us have at the moment is that the places we build, the places she gives planning consent for, are the ones where people want to sell them. And there's no strategic overview saying, in the country, this is where we need housing most, and these are the places that are most sustainable to build it. It's what land comes to the market, gets bought, gets planning consent. So if we can affect that, you could make a big change. And then we'll get the land that's not in floodplain, that's close to the city centre so everyone can walk, so we don't have to worry about stopping people having cars because they won't need them. It'll be near a transport hub, etc., etc. And we can go down a long list of sustainability items that will define where the best land is. But at the moment, we can't make that decision because we can only use the land that's available to build on, and we're undersupplying both in Lancaster and as a nation. And we know that housing is a big problem. The third way we affect sustainability is the individual houses we build. How energy efficient can we make them, and how adaptable to climate change can we make them? And I'll say a couple of things about that. First, with how energy efficient can we make them, Puran has absolutely nailed it, saying make it simple. Don't over-engineer it. There is a limit. You may have heard of Passive House, which is a very, very high standard of energy efficiency. I would love to build my own passive house, but I know if I built 10,000 a year, 15,000 a year, whatever, it would cost too much, so I'd never be able to buy land, so I'd never build any actually. They're complex to live in and run, and I know that we would have problems with air quality, mold growth, etc., because people need to learn and want to learn how to live in these houses properly. They need to know that if you leave the door open for 20 minutes, it's going to take 3 hours for the house to heat up again. If you turn the fan off because it's noisy, you're going to get mold growth. If you don't clean the foot, they're complicated things. So we've got to keep the technology as simple as possible. We can get 75% of the way there, and then we've got to look at the other 26 million homes that we've got already in the country. I said there were two things, wasn't there? That was the first. The second is actually about standards, not just about energy efficiency, but about climate adaptability. So at the moment, there are a set of standards called the National Space Standards, and they've got a recommendation for room height, which is 2.3 metres, which sounds pretty low. We build just above it. Most house builders are around that level. If you go to Australia, I think it's Victoria, and you want to build an apartment, a flat, the minimum ceiling height is 2.7 metres. The reason they do that there is because with the hotter temperature, to get air movement and air mixing, you need the higher ceiling height, and it helps with higher windows and more light and all sorts of things. We're not the same climate as there, but it's just an example of the sort of adaptations we should be making to our housing to make it better for the climate that we're going to have in 50 years' time. Back to those 26 million homes. I don't know what the figure is, but it's thousands of years it will take us to replace all the housing in this country. So what we're building now will certainly be here in 50 years, probably 100, probably 200 years. So we need to start thinking about what we're doing. Regulation helps me, because it makes all house builders work off a level playing field. I can't do it on my own because I won't be able to afford to build and sell those houses.
My name's Chris Coates. I've run the whole sort of gamut of the housing market. I am a homeless person turned property developer. And in between, I've been a construction worker on building sites. I'm a carpenter by trade, and I've been heavily involved in most of that time with what is now called community-led housing. Community-led housing has become a catch-all phrase for lots of different things. Essentially, it's being looked at as a third sector in the housing market, not the private sector, not private house builders or landlords, and not the sort of social housing sector run by councils, council housing, or now mostly housing associations. It is a very broad section of the market now, and the cross-party government is supporting the development of community-led housing. It is pumping a large amount of money into the sector to try and see if we can grow what is essentially people doing housing for themselves in one way or another, or communities doing the housing for themselves. So it ranges, and it's not new. It ranges from a whole charity, sort of historic charity sector, things like alms houses, going right back a long way, through sort of charities, one or two well-known charities that have done house building, Roundtree Trust, Peabody, who've done sort of early social housing, right through things like self-build, people building their own houses, either your grand design sort of build, or even groups of people getting together and building their own houses. It includes housing cooperatives, and a new phenomena around there has been student housing cooperatives, certainly in the bigger cities like Edinburgh, Bristol, places like that, students organising to provide their own houses because they're fed up with what is either offered by the universities or by the private market sector. At the other end of that sort of spectrum is the group I was involved in setting up in Lancaster, and building at Holton, is co-housing, which is a form of market housing. We all own our own houses. It was privately financed. We took out a bank loan to fund the project. We built 41 eco houses just outside of Lancaster in Holton. They are passive house. I live in a passive house. There are not some of the problems that Nick referred to. Yes, you do have to learn how to live in them. It has reduced my energy bills by 84% compared to the terraced house I lived in Lancaster. The aim is 75%. We've managed 84%. Our architect now says he thinks they were being very conservative and potentially put more insulation in our houses than we actually needed to meet the target. Just to put that 84% saving into context, my heating bill for and I only have the heating on for 6 months in the winter, is £2.50 a week. That is my heating bill. That's what an 84% reduction on your heating does. And it's been done pretty much simply. It's conventional construction, it's concrete block, insulated cavity wall. It's just a hell of a lot of insulation and a hell of a lot of what we used to call draft stripping. It can be done. I think regulation needs to come in. We built because we thought that the building regulations were going to demand this. They were shelved in the sort of about 2012. The new building regulations were shelved. If they were brought back in, all houses will be having to meet a similar standard to the one we're building to. The other thing that regulation might do, and I think this is a sort of overarching thing, is if the court case that was upheld in appeal on the third runway at Heathrow, the Paris Climate Agreement, if that is legally binding, on infrastructure projects, I don't see why it's not legally binding on every single planning application that comes forward, and why we cannot demand a climate assessment of building projects in the same way as we demand an air quality assessment and the environmental impact assessment, why we cannot be required to put forward a climate assessment. And one last thing is, I think there's a missing thing that's not being talked about, and that is something to do with housing justice. And that is the people who are sleeping out on the streets who cannot afford, and they are only the tip of the iceberg of the people who cannot afford decent housing. We need to be able to do something about that. And there is potential in the community-led housing sector to address housing justice. There is an amazing project up in Edinburgh called Social Bite, which is providing what's called tiny houses to get people off the streets with support from charities doing social care. That is something that we need to do regardless of what we do for climate change. The people who are going to be most affected are the people sleeping in the doorways outside.
Yeah, I'm Nick Wilkinson, Loom Properties. I'll give you a quick background on me, some of the constraints that our properties have, the work that we've done from an environmental perspective, and that will be both physical and the non-physical stuff. So basically, I did do 10 years working for the health service as a project manager. I was doing health centres, and then 10 years ago I came back home to work with my family business. We have about 30 properties, and we're a bit sort of special in that they're all in Lancaster city centre. And they're a mixture of shops, apartments for student lets, and also some residential properties as well. I have also basically been a non-executive director on a local housing association, a small one. So I've done some work with sort of the wider housing association side of things as well. Our properties are very interesting. That's why I enjoy what I do. I do basically everything from unblocking someone's toilet if they have an issue, through to dealing with the bank the next day with regards to raising finance for a new project. So it's a very varied job, but it does give me a very good understanding of the issues that you will have with tenants on a daily basis, and also the issues you'll have with raising finance for a new project. All our properties are pre-1900. We've got a number of blocks which are listed buildings, and they obviously come with their own issues. All the properties are within the conservation area. Does everyone know what the conservation area is? Basically, it's planning guidance, which basically says Lancaster city centre is an area of historic importance, and as such you will need to abide by certain planning constraints. So what we're meaning there is things like keeping the buildings looking in the same condition as what they were built with. So maintaining timber windows where you've got timber sash windows, not putting new PVC in, maintaining single glazing when you've got single glazed windows with the old Victorian sashes, keeping slate roofs, not changing the facade of the building, so that is the stone and things like that. So you really start to get quite constrained about what you can do. I mean, even putting in a new gas supply, I believe, up the front of a building, if your building is listed, you're not allowed to actually put a gas supply up the front of the building. I'm looking over just to check I'm right on that. Am I right on that? Right, but yeah, okay. So basically, yes, we are limited. Does everyone know what an energy performance certificate is?
Assume we don't.
Okay. Well, basically, as when you sell a house or when you rent a house, you are obliged by the government to have an energy performance certificate. It is an EU thing, but I think it's obviously staying now we're leaving the EU. And basically, I think we said earlier, categories A to G. The current standard is a minimum of a category E. Most of our properties fall in the category D or C bracket. Bear in mind they are pre-1900, so we're talking some very old buildings. Some of them are even 1700s. And basically, if you don't have a category E, you're not allowed to basically rent out your property. So you have to essentially meet that standard now. I think it is moving to category D as well soon. So I'm in a difficult position at times because we have the constraints of not being able to change things, but the need to meet an environmental standard for a building. I'm also, I would say, quite environmentally conscious and aware. So the kind of things that we've done, over the past 10 years, I mean, we do an interesting situation in that with our student market, we do provide bills all inclusive. So in a way, it's in our own interests to make sure those buildings are as environmentally friendly as possible with regards to the use of the bills. That said, we do put a cap in our contracts on the amount of energy that our tenants can use. And we do that both from a cost perspective, from ourselves in terms of limiting our risk, but also from a personal perspective, because we obviously want to make sure that they don't actually just waste energy and leave the heating on all the time. So we've done loads of things. So just to give you a few examples, we've changed glazing. So if we can't put double glazing in, we've used secondary glazing. We've improved all our insulation in loft spaces where we can do it without any physical impact on the outside of the building. We've been moving from electric heating, where we've inherited flats with electric heating, installing gas where we can, which is a more efficient way of heating a property. An uninsulated property, should we say, in the respective and not the passive house. And obviously things like lights and light bulbs and what have you, and changing them all to the more energy efficient side of things. Non-physical side, sounds a bit daft, but recycling, especially in city centres, because you must always remember you don't always have space for bins. And recycling is not easy if you don't have any storage space for bins. So we've been working very closely with the council's refuse team to look at the recycling side of things. We've actually moved all our energy over to a company called Bulb, which is environmental, they 100% green with regards to electric, and then they do a carbon offset. And I think, as I said earlier, we do track all our usage for all of the energy accounts that we have, and we do notify our tenants if they're using too much energy to try and make sure that they act sensibly and consciously. Thank you.
Thank you very much.